Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our webinar series, Embracing Change. We've got Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's joining us. Should be turning on his video and audio any second now. There we go. Hey, Doc, how you doing?
Hey, Feisal, how you doing?
All right. Thank you very much for being with us. I know it's very late. It's actually midnight for you. So truly, thank you for taking the time. I know the daytime is very busy, so you've taken some of your sleep to be of service to us. We're truly grateful for those who are on the call as we speak, and for others who will join later as they watch the recording. So I wrote out an email on Monday, and as I share and I speak to a lot of families that we serve, those who are in there, I would say 50 plus, or maybe sometimes mid 40s, the elephant in the room is actually dementia. It used to be cancer, and I'm not saying cancer is out the door, but dementia is really the elephant in the room. And so, since we've spoken and we've, had the honor and privilege to have you as part of the ecosystem, which really I'm truly, truly grateful. I thought, we would spend some time together and really just go back to the basics, right? And really try to understand, what are we talking about? What does it even mean? And then how can we support, what's cognitive health? How can we support it? And how can we, quote unquote, prevent that decline that seems to be happening? How early, so we'll go step by step, if that's okay with you, Doc. I know it's a bit, maybe very basic for you, but I think it's very fundamental, because we have all these misnomers and ideas that are not really there, and we have either family members like myself, my grandfather, my grandmother, and sometimes friends that are going through this, and we feel lost, Doctor. We really feel lost. So over to you, Doctor. Just maybe start basics, and I'll kind of ask as we go, but really would love to have your guidance on this.
Yeah, and as I'll talk about today, and then we'll talk about we've really gotten to the point where, as I'll show you, this is now optional for the first time. And so we all, as you said, we worry about this. It is now the #1 concern as people as we age, losing our cognitive abilities. And I have to tell a quick story where I just got back from the 50th reunion of my high school class.
Oh, wow.
And this is now 50 plus. Because of the pandemic, it was delayed for a year, so it was really 51.
Okay.
But one of my competitors for valedictorian of our class, I found out is in a nursing home with end-stage dementia. This is a guy who was brilliant in high school and college, and was a very productive person, highly intelligent. And unfortunately, at my same age, is in a nursing home. So this is something that we all worry about. And as I'll show you today, part of the problem is that people haven't understood what this is all about, as you know. And another part of it, an important part of the problem, is people wait till very, very late. And so we'll talk a little bit about how can we get on early, prevention or earliest reversal. And if we were all to do that, we really could make this a very rare disease. Surprising to hear, I know, but I'll show you why that is the case. Now, Feisal, do you mind if I just share a couple of slides here to give a little background?
That would be great. But maybe also what is cognitive health? Like, what does that even mean?
Sure.
Maybe let's start with that, very basic, and then we can go to what's happening and the research and all of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so cognition involves the use of our brain. We think often in terms of memory, very important. And there's very short-term memory, long-term memory. So these are different types of memory, and they have different mechanisms, but they're all related to our ability to have neuroplasticity, to change our brains, to remember things, which is so important for our functioning day to day. But of course, there are many other features of cognition. There's so-called executive function, where we do things like planning and organizing. There is, of course, the ability to read, the ability to write, and which people can lose, so-called agraphia, if they lose the ability to write, for example, and alexia, the inability to read. Then there's the loss of the ability to calculate, so-called acalculia. And then, of course, recognition of objects. And then reasoning. All of these things are critical parts of our brain. And so what happens is when we have good cognitive health, we're able to use the things that we've learned, and we're able to learn and store new information, both of those. When we are having poor cognitive health, we start to lose the ability to change. We lose the ability to learn and utilize new things. And ultimately, we start to lose the ability that we had for the storage of old things. And one of the concerns here is that we've learned a lot during our lifetimes. If we're living to 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or 80, we keep the most important information, how to read, how to write, how to calculate, how to interact with others, how to recognize, all those sorts of things. And so if you think about it, your brain is deciding when things are not sufficient, when you don't have enough support for your brain. It will often sacrifice the thing that is least important. In fact, what it basically says is, okay, you can do a tremendous amount with what you already have, and I'm going to sacrifice the ability to learn new things. And that's one of the reasons why learning new things is one of the earliest losses, because you can do so much. Now, the problem with that is people will just ignore it. I can still drive my car, I can still play tennis, I can do my job for the most part, I can do all these things. And unfortunately, they don't seek help. And unfortunately, we as physicians tell them, look, there's nothing we can do anyway, so don't bother to come in early. And that's where we need a major change in the way we consider this. If everybody would come in earlier, get on prevention or the earliest reversal, again, we could make this a very rare condition. And just look, when we talk about cancer, look what early screening has done to help cancer survivors. So think of pap smears, think of PSA tests, think of chest x-rays, think of colonoscopies. These things have really changed the outcomes, where we catch things early. And mammography, another good example. We catch things early, or we can catch things early if everything's done correctly, and people have normal lifespans. So these are all critical pieces. With Alzheimer's, people aren't doing that enough yet because they don't think anything's done. So what they do is the opposite. Well, I'm not that bad yet. I'm not, oh, my spouse isn't so great either, on and on and on, when we should be coming in as early. And I'll show you that because of what we can do, it's actually a good idea to do that. So as you said, cognition is all about the functioning of the brain for the interaction with our environment.
So thank you for that. Now, just let's go a little molecular, if you don't mind, the micro. Yeah. How do I know that I'm not able to learn? Like, that seems a bit far out. Like, how would I know, right? I'm 53, I did a cognoscopy with you, right? But how would I know I'm not able to learn? Like, what is actually happening? Like, is it obvious, or is it something that's subtle? Like, how does that happen?
Well, both. So it can start out subtly and become more obvious. So people will notice change. Of course, we're set up as organisms to notice change. We have this wonderful mechanism for neuroplasticity, where our brains change, as Dr. Deutsch has pointed out over the years, for anyone who's read his books, things like the brain that changes itself and things like that. So you're changing so that you're adapting to things, so that, now you know how to drive, or now you know how to speak a foreign language, or adapting to your environment. And so when you start to notice that things aren't quite the same, maybe you can't remember phone numbers the way you used to, maybe you don't remember names the way you used to, maybe you don't remember other things. So someone might say, a common thing I'll hear is, my spouse asked me the same question 3 times at dinner last night, that sort of thing. Or, forgetting your keys repeatedly. And again, people will try to minimize that. Well, it's normal to forget your keys. Well, occasionally. But if this becomes a pattern, then you know that something is not quite right. We'll forget, what we plan to do, things like that. And then there are what we call non-amnestic changes, which are the less common ones. And I hear this all the time. I can't make a tip anymore. or I don't recognize others, or I get lost in space. So they'll be driving down, a common thing is they'll be driving down a road, which is a road that they're familiar with. And suddenly they just don't know, well, do I turn right? Do I turn left? That's a very common one, and people will get lost. And in fact, spatial memory is affected frequently in early cognitive changes. So all those sorts of things are things to look out for.
Okay. So so that's, you're giving us a definition of what could be the events that could alarm you or kind of nudge you, that maybe we want to look at this a little further. Now, what are the supportive things, if that's the direction we want to go right now, to support cognitive health before we go into when things are going sideways?
Yeah, well, I'm going to show
Okay,
a whole set
right.
of things that will support optimal cognitive health, because you're exactly right. You know, it's so interesting. Most of us don't think about optimal cognitive health. We think about normal cognitive health, and that is a huge difference. People are surprised when they get on an optimal program and they say, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had these abilities. I didn't know I had so much energy. I didn't know I could remember as well as I could. One of the very first patients that came in is actually in the book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. The one I called Patient Zero came in back in April of 2012. And she had clear early symptoms of Alzheimer's. Her mother had died of Alzheimer's. And after she went on our protocol, 3 months later, she called up and said, I can't believe it. My memory's better than it's been in 20 years. So she did the right things. She changed her support for her brain, because as I'll show, when you really look at what is the fundamental nature of cognitive decline, which is leading to Alzheimer's, it is really about an insufficiency of support. You've got a supply, you've got a demand, and unfortunately, the demand is exceeding the supply chronically. And so your brain is responding by going into a protective downsizing mode. And by the way,
it's survival then, basically.
Very analogous to what happened in the pandemic. So what we were told over a year and a half ago is shelter in place, social distancing, because we have an insult. So everybody pulled back, stopped going to their jobs, more Zoom, those sorts of things. And what happened? We go into a recession. Your brain is literally doing the same thing. It is recognizing insults, in this case, typically not SARS-CoV-2, although it can be, but it's typically a whole set of things. And therefore, it is going into a protective downsizing mode, just as we did as a globe with the pandemic. And your brain is now responding to that. And you're realizing, I can't do the things that I could do before.
And how does the brain decide what to sacrifice? It decides by itself, or it's smart? Is it smart or not?
I'm going to show you that. Well, it's adaptive. So there's an evolution there. And it depends to some extent on where the insults are. Did they come in through your nose, through your mouth, through your bloodstream? How did they come in? And then it depends on what those insults are, how severe they are. And your brain is then deciding how to deal with them. Because as I'll show you, what's amazing is that the actual pathology, and Alzheimer's is defined pathologically, involves this stuff which we call amyloid, which turns out to be an antimicrobial. So your brain is protecting itself. But again, just as with the pandemic, as it's protecting itself, it's pulling back and downsizing. So let's show, if it's okay, let me share the screen here.
Perfect.
And let's go into a couple of these items. And let's do that.
And then at some point, I'd like to also understand the difference between Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and some of the other, so that people understand what does all this mean. Sorry, go ahead, Dale.
Yes, so as I'll show, we really are at the first period now where if we all do the right things, we can truly make this an optional disease. And for anyone, especially anyone who's had this in their family, very important to do that, to get on appropriate prevention or earliest reversal so that you don't ever have to worry about this. So first, though, I just want to mention that it's important to talk about the semantics of what has been called success in Alzheimer's. I think everybody heard about the drug aducanumab, which is also called Aduhelm, which was approved by the FDA over the objections of the experts panel back on June 7th. And it's important to point out this drug does not make people better. It does not stabilize the disease. What it does is in one trial at one dose only, it slowed the decline by 22%. So if you don't have any treatment and you have so-called mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's, you lose about 3.4 points on a 30-point scale, which is what's used for example, the mini mental status or the MoCA test, which is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. You lose about this much of it. If you go on this drug, the best you get is you lose a little less. Whereas our trial results, we'll talk a little bit about today, we actually showed people improving as opposed to just slowing their decline. So it's important to recognize the semantics. So I'm going to just spend one moment talking about the guts of this, the core. If you look under the hood, what's going on in your brain with your cognition? As we talked about a minute ago, it's not just about making abnormal cognition normal. It's about making what we call normal cognition better than usual, enhancing your cognition, which we'd all like to do. We'd all like to be able to think better, have more energy, do better at our work, etc. And that's exactly what you do. It's very much related to what the other side, that is Alzheimer's, and doing the right things to get optimal cognition. So at the center of this disease, we spent 30 years in the laboratory studying neurodegenerative phenomena. And if you look at we're now blowing up one cell here. So here's the cell membrane, here's outside the cell, this is the brain cell inside the cell, and there is a receptor sticking through the membrane here, mostly outside, a little bit inside, which is called APP, amyloid precursor protein. This is the guy that gives rise to that amyloid that collects in the brains that tells you, oh, this is Alzheimer's disease. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it responds. It's like a molecular switch. It responds to what's going on. Again, just like with the pandemic, when things are good, and you can think about this as being like, the president of a country or the CEO of a company, when things are good, this guy sends out a memo, one for outside the cell, one for inside the cell, that says, things are good, go ahead and make new memories, grow and interact. And so in so doing, it's cut at one site. You got one piece outside, you got one piece inside. And you can trace the molecular pathways. As an example, estradiol, an estrogen, causes a whole bunch of genes to make new proteins. And one of those proteins is the one that cuts right here. So that supports your memory. And that's been known for many, many years. On the other hand, when things are not so good, if you haven't had enough sleep, if you've had a lot of stress, if you've got ongoing infections, if you've got exposure to toxins, if you have a leaky gut, and there are dozens of other things, now your brain is saying, I'm under attack. I have got to pull back. And in that case, it's cut at 3 different sites, and it produces 4 different pieces of this protein. These are called peptides. And here you can see, here's the A beta. So here's the thing that the drug companies have tried to get rid of, but it's a much bigger story than that. And this thing is actually protective. It is a protective downsizing response. Your brain is now saying, okay, things are bad, I'm under attack. So I'm going to pull back and I'm going to focus more on defense than I am on growth and maintenance. Now, that's okay as long as you now shuttle back and forth. But the problem is people get for years on this bad side because they have these ongoing insults. So basically, we now understand that this is essentially a disease of insufficiency. We're on the wrong side of this for too long. So we want to do everything to get rid of the insults that are causing this and to get on the good side there. So that's really all there is to it. And there are several things we can do. So the first thing, energetics. And most of us really don't know if we've got appropriate energetics. And that really involves 4 things. Blood flow, which is, by the way, why exercise is one of the many things. And each one of these things by itself is not everything. It's not a cure for Alzheimer's, but putting them all together is quite powerful. Go ahead.
I'm saying it stacks up, right? It's all the stacking.
Absolutely, stacks up, exactly right. Again, this is we're talking about an insufficiency. So this is a network dysfunction, and we're now fixing that network just like you would fix a country or a company by making key player changes, or a football team, by making critical changes to make it so that everything works together optimally. So the energetics, it's blood flow, but it's also oxygenation. And most people do not know whether their oxygen is dropping at night when they go to sleep. Easy to check. We check it as part of our protocol. Some people have sleep apnea, for example. Some people have other things, something is called upper airway resistance syndrome. So there are different ways that you can drop your oxygenation at night, and that actually harms your brain. So you want to get it optimal. And the third thing is your mitochondrial function. Your mitochondria are the batteries of your cells. They're the ones with the energy and the power. So we want to make sure that they're working optimally. And then finally, it's giving appropriate substrates for your mitochondria to burn. And that's ketones and glucose. And when you're healthy, you should be able to go back and forth between using glucose and using ketones. Now, here's what's interesting. As we get a little older and things are not quite as good as they were in terms of our cognition, you actually lose both of those, unfortunately. So you really do have an emergency situation. You lose the glucose ability because so many of us develop insulin resistance. About 40% of the population develops insulin resistance. It's incredibly common. And now you're not able to lose the glucose. And by the way, you can see that on a PET scan for years before people get Alzheimer's disease. You can see the signature of Alzheimer's, which is reduced utilization of glucose in the temporal and parietal regions. So this is the signature of Alzheimer's disease. The other thing to use is ketones. This comes from burning fat. So when you're in good shape, you can go back and forth and do these. When you're in bad shape, you lose both. You can't make or use ketones because one of the things that stops you from making them is high insulin levels. And you've got the high insulin levels because of the fact that you've got this insulin resistance. So you really have the worst of both worlds. And we, in our treatment, in our optimization of cognition, we want to restore both of those so that you can utilize both. The second thing then is
Can I ask a question before you? So
yes, of course.
40% you mentioned, is that US data or is that global data?
That's US data.
Okay,
so yeah,
it's probably a little skewed. Do you agree, or is it?
It probably is a little bit, and certainly it relates to unfortunately a high carbohydrate diet. So any countries where there are high carbohydrate diets, they will have that similar around 40% or so. But you're right, countries where it's a much, much lower carb diet will have a lower percentage. That's absolutely right.
And then
and along with that,
go ahead.
Right.
On the oxygenation, would it be recommended to go into these oxygen chambers and sit for 45 minutes or whatever the time is on a regular basis? Does that help, or is that not what we're talking about?
It can. So here's the interesting thing. For each of us, we have certain rate limiting steps, which is why we want to look at these different things, because they all line up. So again, it's just like if you've got a football team where the main problem is that the halfback isn't very good, then replacing the end doesn't help you. You got to replace the halfback. So yes, for some people where the oxygen is a limiting factor, is a contributing factor, and that's why it's good to check it. You can do it very easily with an oximeter. You can buy an oximeter. Your doctor can lend you one. You can do a standard sleep study. Lots of ways to get at this, and then you can see that. And you're absolutely right. There are two ways. If it is low, two ways to address it. For some people, this basically is saying there's a vascular component to your cognitive changes. For some people, using either HBOT, which is the hyperbaric oxygen you were referring to, or EWOT is another good one, which is exercise with oxygen therapy. So you're actually doing with a mask of oxygen while you're doing some exercise. That's another very good way to do it. And of course, if you actually have sleep apnea, you can do things like CPAP, or there are some very good dental devices that will actually help you to stop that obstruction that occurs with breathing at night. So these things are all very, very helpful. Second one here is insulin sensitivity. And again, this goes with the fact that for people who have high carb diets, this is a real problem for your brain, unfortunately. The third one is trophic support. So getting enough growth factors, hormones, and nutrients, and things like vitamin D turn out to be very helpful. And again, lots of similarities between COVID-19. There are many similarities where poor outcomes from COVID-19 often related to low vitamin D, low zinc, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. Those are same factors for risk for Alzheimer's disease. Same story: hypertension, obesity, type 2 diabetes, vitamin D, zinc, same ideas. So many of the risk factors are the same. Not all, but many of them are. And in fact, I should mention, in both COVID-19 and in Alzheimer's, you have a situation in which your innate immune system, that's the older part of your immune system, the non-specific part, which gives you the inflammation, is high, and the adaptive system, which is clearing out specific things like bacteria, viruses, and things like that, not good enough. So, of course, what happens in COVID-19, people die of cytokine storm because they've got the high cytokines and they're not clearing the virus. With Alzheimer's, the same thing happens, but instead of cytokine storm in just a few days, it's cytokine drizzle, which takes years and years. But you're making, as long as you've got that ongoing inflammation, you're going to make more of that amyloid. Your brain is saying, I've got to prevent myself from being attacked by these bacteria, viruses, etc. So same idea there.
Wow.
Then resolution of inflammation, as I said, and prevention of further inflammation, removing the source, which can be a leaky gut. It can be poor dentition. One of the most common ones is a change in the oral microbiome. And in fact, one of the organisms that's associated with poor dentition, periodontitis, is called P. gingivalis, and it is found in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease. So again, keeping good dentition turns out to be, and keeping an optimal oral microbiome actually turns out to be quite an important thing for optimal cognition, surprisingly.
So gum disease, also gum disease, or?
Absolutely, gingivitis, periodontitis. So there's a lot of oral health related, also mercury amalgams, also herpes simplex, also associated with cognitive change. So optimizing those things, very helpful for best cognition.
But on the inflammation, what about diet? Are there specific, like everybody now, including myself, we're like, okay, let's go minimal dairy, let's go minimal gluten. Is that helping, or is that just where,
Absolutely, absolutely helping. And there are a lot of published studies. And if you just look at the biochemistry, the diet that works the best, we call this KetoFlex 12-3, because it is a combination. You want to drive people into mild ketosis. It is a plant-rich. It doesn't have to be all plants, but you want it to be largely plants because you want the phytonutrients, you want the appropriate vitamins and minerals, and also you want the appropriate fiber. It is a high fiber diet. Fine to have some wild-caught fish. Fine to have some grass-fed beef. Fine to have some pastured chicken, some pastured eggs, or if you want to avoid those, that's okay too. What we're going for here is an optimal biochemistry to make and keep new synapses, to support your brain, to keep the inflammation down, and to keep the toxicity down. And so absolutely the diet turns out to be very helpful. The basic 7 things are diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and some targeted supplements. Those are the big 7 that are actually very, very helpful to optimize your cognition. And then in the book that we published called The End of Alzheimer's Program, that was the second book. This actually goes into how do you enhance normal cognition. So that's the goal there, and goes into the critical pieces for those. So again, most people are doing these things suboptimally. Exercise, there's some great things out there. I mentioned EWAT earlier. Also Katsu bands, which by the way, some of the Olympic athletes used. These are restrictive bands that were developed in Japan that actually slightly impede flow, so you can do less exercise. Essentially, you get more bang for the amount of exercise that you do, and it enhances flow overall. So people are getting better and better about doing the right things. The sleep I already mentioned, you want to make sure your oxygenation is good. And for most people, you want to try to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. I know we've all gone along with the 1 hour or 0 hours at times. I just flew back from the East Coast, as I mentioned a couple of days ago at the reunion. And it was an early morning flight after a late night of reunion. So I got virtually zero sleep. So, okay, I got to catch up over the next few days, trying to get, 8 hours a night to the extent I can, try to keep the oxygenation good. And by the way, you can check it on an Apple Watch and things like that. The new Oura rings, you can also check your oxygenation. So any of these, and I should mention, wearables are going to help so many of us to avoid cognitive decline and to optimize our cognition. Think of this. You can check now, which you couldn't do just a few years ago. You can check your telomere length, your microbiome, your oral DNA. You can check your heart rate variability, your blood pressure. You can check your sleep status. You can check your oxygenation. It is fantastic what we all have access to. And again, when you think about these chronic illnesses like Alzheimer's, the problem with them is that we don't know these variables, and so things sneak up on us over the years. If you're able to look at these along the time, you can see way ahead of when you would have problems. You'll see, for example, when I was up all night a few nights ago, my heart rate variability, which is typically 70, 90, 110 in that range, was 11. It was the lowest it's ever been because, more stress, things were not good, and you can see it. You can see, and I got, unfortunately, despite vaccination, a few months ago, my wife and I traveled and got the Delta variant, and you could see that the VO2 max went down. My cardiac status suffered, as many people's does, with the COVID-19. And then after I had it for a few days and was getting better, you could see that it's now slowly coming back toward normal. So these are really good warning signs for all of us and can help us to optimize. As Ariana Huffington has said, this is not just about prevention, it's about performance. And I think she made a very good point with that. So this helps all of us.
But on the carb side, I know we're looking at insulin sensitivity. Now, I mean, if you said to me, Feisal, no carbs, right? Direct or indirect, I would be very upset.
No simple carbs. I mean, vegetables have carbs, but they're complex carbs. Those are fine. They don't spike your blood pressure. And by the way, there's another one, CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. For anyone who hasn't done that, it's one of the most important things you can do. What we find is that people will say, wow, I'm spiking when I think I'm eating something that's good, like oatmeal sometimes. And now I know not to spike like this. I know to avoid those things. But I'm also then, once you spike, you now tank. So I'm waking up in the middle of the night, some people will tell me, and my glucose is only 45. Well, that's bad for your brain too. So we now have both the high and the low are bad for your brain function. You can smooth it out with the appropriate, get those simple carbs down, get the fiber up, get a good fats diet, the things like avocados and nuts and things like that. Now you're much smoother. You don't have the peaks and you don't have the valleys, and your brain will function much better.
Okay. All right. So you're talking about the 2 week, you get the...
Yeah, you can do it with Freestyle Libre. You can do it with a Dexcom. There are a number of these out now. But having continuous glucose monitoring, very helpful. And people are really surprised at what they see. And by the way, you also know about the CQ test. We have a simple test through Apollo Health where people can check and see. And I recommend anyone who's over 40, please at some point check and see where your status is, check and see if things are going well. Don't let this sneak up on you. You can do a very simple cognitive evaluation in just a few minutes and see where things stand. And if things aren't optimal, you can then get on an appropriate protocol so that you can optimize things. So just to finish this up, then we want to treat any pathogens that people have, and that may be in the mouth. It may find that you have Lyme disease that's been undiagnosed. That's a common one. There was a beautiful study out of Taiwan that showed that people who had outbreaks of herpes simplex on their lip, if they simply treated those, they reduced their risk for dementia quite substantially. So there's another pathogen. Again, what we're calling Alzheimer's disease is the response to these things. So if we can deal with them and not have your brain have to make amyloid to deal with them, you're going to do much, much better. And then detoxification. And I was just actually a few minutes ago talking to my daughter, who is a brain health coach that uses this protocol with her patients. And we were going over data on toxicity. And this is the data she's looking at for herself. And so there are different toxins. And again, what happens? Your brain responds to this toxicity, and it's 3 different types. Inorganics, things you get, for example, from air pollution. Organics, things like glyphosate and formaldehyde and benzene and toluene and these sorts of chemical toxins. And then it's biotoxins, things that you would get from things like molds. And many of us don't realize that we're living in the midst of molds. The molds are making these things because they're trying to protect themselves. And unfortunately, many of us are living with molds. Now, many molds don't make these, but there are 5 different molds, which are Stachybotrys, Penicillium, Aspergillus, Chaetomium, Wallemia. Those are the big 5, and they make these neurotoxins. And so they can, over time, erode your neural architecture, erode your brain. So that's another. So we want to detox from those. We want to get some stimulation. People do this with brain training. Of course, that works very well. They do it with light stimulation or magnetic stimulation, all those sorts of things. We want to improve our adaptive immune system, just as I mentioned earlier. So we want to have enough vitamin D. We want to have enough zinc. We want to have enough protection, enough N-acetylcysteine, things like that. So very clear things we can do for that. And then we want to ultimately reduce the amyloid beta, which is the stuff that's responding. And then ultimately we want to make sure that we have regeneration if needed. Again, we do all the right things. You don't need regeneration because you're preventing the degeneration to begin with. So let me just say a word about this term, mild cognitive impairment, because this has been a problem. Doctors will tell you, oh, you've got some complaints. Don't worry, you only have mild cognitive impairment. Well, it's very important, because this is like saying to someone, don't worry, you have only mildly metastatic cancer. This is a relatively late stage of the disease. Now, there are 4 stages in going from normal all the way to Alzheimer's disease, just like going from normal to full-on diabetic with diabetic ketoacidosis. You go through stage of insulin resistance and stage of pre-diabetes, so you can catch it then, which is fantastic. Same thing happens with Alzheimer's. The first phase, you don't notice symptoms, but already there can be changes. And by the way, the Alzheimer's diagnosis typically comes 20 years after these beginning biochemical changes. So we really have a tremendous opportunity to intervene. So at that time, you can already see an abnormal PET scan if you look, or spinal fluid. Then phase 2 is SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. This lasts for about 10 years. So we'll go through a period, very, very fixable during that time. You notice that something's not quite right. Your spouse will often notice it. Your coworkers may notice it and say, hey, things aren't quite as sharp as they were before. You may be forgetting. This is where you're forgetting some keys and things like that. But you're still testing normally by definition on cognitive testing. Then the third phase out of 4 is what's called mild cognitive impairment, which is why I have a concern when doctors say, oh, you just have MCI, mild cognitive impairment, come back next year. No, this is a relatively late stage of the problem. You really want to jump in and optimize things. Now you do have abnormal cognitive testing, but you still are able to do your activities of daily living. 5 to 10% of those people convert to full-blown Alzheimer's disease each year. And so what we call Alzheimer's is the 4th phase. And as I said, typically diagnosed about 20 years after. So what we used to think of as a disease of our 60s, 70s, and 80s is really a disease of our 40s, 50s, and 60s that's just diagnosed 20 years later. So if we can just get people to get on prevention, or earliest reversal, we can truly make this a rare disease. The bottom line is virtually no one needs to get this problem, believe it or not. Now, when you say that someone has Alzheimer's, it means now that their activities of daily living are affected. So this is a very, very late stage of the problem. And again, doing all the things right, this will become a former scourge. Most of us didn't wake up this morning worrying about leprosy, but in the past, people worried about it a lot. We didn't wake up worrying about polio or smallpox. These were all scourges in their own time. As you indicated earlier, Alzheimer's is now the elephant in the room. It's the current scourge. I remember very well when HIV went from something that everybody worried about to something that is very treatable. And so obviously very, very many people have had good outcomes. We're headed in the same direction. We will get there with Alzheimer's. And again, if we just encourage people to optimize things, get on appropriate prevention and optimize their current status, they can do very, very well. So let me stop the sharing there and then we can continue our discussion. There we go.
So we'll start. Please, everyone, please put in your questions. I know, obviously, almost all of you that are on the call, and some of you, this is very, very personal in your homes. Some of you, it's a little further to friends and family. So please, ask the questions. So the first question that's just come in is, to what extent can mental trauma contribute to Alzheimer's? So that's one of the stress factors, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there are in several ways. And so it absolutely can contribute. And it's a common contributor, both physical trauma, so head injury, things like that, and mental trauma. And here's an example. When you have ongoing stress, if you've got stress that comes up and then you're de-stressed and you're doing very well, and you have occasional, we're actually designed evolutionarily to handle stress that comes and goes. It's the chronic stress that we are not set up to do. Just moving your cortisol up, which is what happens with stress, actually shrinks your brain. And in fact, if you go back to the pathways that we talked about earlier, if you simply look at the cortisol itself, so when you make cortisol, your brain makes something which is called CRF, corticotropin releasing factor. And this stuff actually turns out to bind to a receptor, which increases the markers of Alzheimer's disease. So it is part and parcel of that particular problem. And there's no question stress. So in fact, this is why we want to get our heart rate variability up. This is why we want to do some of these breathing exercises. And, as a scientist, I used to think that these were unimportant, things like meditation. And it turns out the data are just irrefutable. The meditation improves blood pressure. It improves neural agility, essentially the ability to make synapses. It improves neuroplasticity. So lots of positives from this. And so absolutely, if you have a lot of mental trauma, another thing that's brought up frequently are the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences and events. So these things absolutely can increase risk for cognitive decline. And so keeping stress to a minimum, managing stress, as I said, fine for it to go up, but you don't want to keep it up for long periods of time because absolutely it can be associated with cognitive decline.
So the other question is, can you please discuss the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? And obviously there's also Parkinson's, right?
Absolutely. We can talk about all of these. There are many different of these neurodegenerative conditions. But here's the thing. So dementia simply means a global loss, a global cognitive decline. And it will often start with memory and then move to other features such as recognition, facial recognition. But as I said, about a third of the time, it will start with a non-amnestic presentation and start with executive dysfunction and things like that. But ultimately, all of these are affected as the brain involutes. Now, that's dementia. The most common cause by far of dementia is Alzheimer's, where when you look at the brain, you see the plaques, these amyloid plaques and the tau tangles. Those are the hallmarks that Professor Alzheimer described over 100 years ago, back in 1906. And so it's defined pathologically. Now, there are other causes of dementia. They're not as common. Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, PSP, something called progressive supranuclear palsy, and on and on. But again, by far the most common is Alzheimer's disease.
What's the difference between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? And do they progress the same, or is it a different route?
Right. So what we now believe is that just as we see that Alzheimer's is an insufficiency, there's a mismatch between the supply and demand. What it looks like now in the research is that each of these involves a different neural subsystem. So with Alzheimer's, you're talking about neuroplasticity, what it takes to make the changes in the brain, and in the inability to support that system. With Parkinson's, it's a different subsystem. That one is involved with motor modulation. So the things that you need to keep your hands still, the things you need to walk quickly, and the things you need to balance yourself. So those are the things instead of the first thing that you lose being memory issues, it's now often motor issues. So people fall down and people have shaking. It used to be called the shaking palsy. People can't walk as quickly as they do. Now that neural subsystem has a different set of chemical requirements. It has turned out that the Achilles heel, and by the way, each of these subsystems has its own Achilles heel. And therefore, depending on what you get exposed to, you may go down the Parkinson's pathway, the Alzheimer's pathway, or others. And of course, it depends on your genetics as well. People tend to be predisposed to have one or the other. In the Parkinson's case, it is about mitochondrial complex 1. So it is, again, it's about energetics, but it's a specific area of energetics. So the people who get Parkinson's have typically been exposed to chemicals or to pathogens that attack that part of the system, the mitochondria. Whereas people with Alzheimer's, it's the things we just described. It's things like not having enough trophic support, not having enough overall blood flow, oxygenation, things like that. They are both neurodegenerative, so they're both saying there's a mismatch. This subsystem is not being supported enough, and they are both associated with response to insults like pathogens, and they both result in downsizing of their specific areas. And then same thing for these others.
So how come we see that in Parkinson's, a lot of people have been constipated for decades? What is the correlation between the constipation and developing Parkinson's? It's what's going on?
I'm glad you brought it up. It's such a great point, actually. Before you get the motor symptoms of Parkinson's, and again, I urge people come in early if you have these symptoms. So there are 3 premotor symptoms, and people don't always have all of them. But if you have them, please get evaluated early because you want to get there before you have the full-on Parkinson's. You mentioned one of them, constipation. Now, of course, the problem is that's relatively non-specific. A lot of people have constipation. But in fact, if you're doing the right things, if you're having the right diet, if you've got the right fiber and so forth and so on, you shouldn't. And in the Honolulu study, simply having people say that they had fewer than 1 bowel movement a day was associated with an increased risk for future Parkinson's. And what happens is the nerves, the enteric nervous system that's involved with the peristalsis of the gut is one of the areas that is damaged in Parkinson's. So the other thing, of course, is you're now not moving the toxins out the way you should be moving them out. So one thing is constipation, as you mentioned. The second thing is anosmia, which is loss of the ability to smell. That is another thing that is often neurological. So if you've lost your ability to smell, or if you've noticed a huge decrease in it recently, please get it checked out. It's a good warning sign for a number of things, and Parkinson's is the most common issue there. You can also change your ability to smell and lose it to some extent with Alzheimer's. But Parkinson's is the one that's probably best known associated. And of course, it happens with other things like trauma. But that's the second thing to think about. The third thing is called REM behavioral disturbance. And what that means is, of course, everyone knows that when you sleep, you dream, you go into REM, rapid eye movement sleep. And what happens is your brainstem, when that happens, it turns off the movement. So that in your sleep, while you're running, while you're doing things in your dream, you're not acting that out and flinging your arms and legs because you have a mechanism that turns that off. Now, unfortunately, when you begin to get some brainstem damage, which happens in Parkinson's, that starts to fail. And so what happens is people will say, oh my gosh, my husband or wife flings their arms around when they dream and actually often knocks the spouse or hits the spouse. Often they'll end up saying, well, I had to sleep in the other room because my spouse just flails when they have dreams. And that's, again, if you have that, please get it checked out. It often precedes both Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. Lewy body is essentially a combination of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And Lewy body has responded quite well to the protocol we developed for Alzheimer's. It is another one that is associated with toxin exposure. So again, all of us can optimize things ahead of time and really minimize our chances of going down this road and having these degenerative conditions in the future. And the big problem has been people don't look ahead of time. They don't do anything about it ahead of time. And as you said, they just kind of the elephant in the room. And then one day they say, oh my gosh, my doctor told me that I now have Alzheimer's disease. Please don't wait.
So the variable, I mean, the wearable, is it reliable, the REM? Because I know there's a standard deviation on it. So if the REM starts to drop and you're monitoring your sleep, you should start to look into that, or we wait for the body movement in the middle of the night?
Well, the REM can drop from many reasons. That's a different scenario.
Okay.
The REM can drop because of alcohol. As they say, alcohol is a REM robber. So just drinking alcohol can rob you of your REM sleep. So yeah, again, great idea to have a wearable. See how your REM's doing. See how the other pieces are doing. And then you can start to make these fine, it's so much better when we can make these fine changes and get improved instead of waiting for when things are way out of whack. That's what these wearables are allowing us to do. Make these fine changes while we're still quite healthy. It's a very different thing when you have REM behavioral disturbance. It's not so much about less REM. It's about flailing your arms and or legs while you are sleeping, and typically during REM.
All right, so this is about, remember I did the cognoscopy with you. So here, yes. Are there any generally available tests that show the first Alzheimer's leading, alterations leading to Alzheimer's, in order to take it from there and do deeper tests? So I think they're talking about the pre-code and the recode that you have.
Yes.
What else is there out there, just so that people can choose, right?
So there are a number of things. Now there is a blood test called, which is now on the market, from Precivity, which looks at Alzheimer's. However, in that case, it's really just looking at the amyloid in your blood is the main thing. Yeah. Fine to do, but what we really want to do is get our risk. So again, just like we don't want to wait until we have a heart attack to say, do we have risk factors for cardiovascular disease? We'd like to look at cholesterol. We'd like to look at the even more important things like LDL particle number that are critical, and HSCRP. Do we have ongoing inflammation? So what we have is a whole set of markers, same idea, and we use this for what we call pre-code, which is prevention of cognitive decline, and recode, reversal of cognitive decline. So as you can imagine, the prevention is a little easier than the reversal. Once you've already got it, you really have to roll things back. You're dealing with something now that's been ongoing for, as I said, up to 20 years. So in the case of pre-code, we're looking at a set of variables. So you want to know, do you have ongoing systemic inflammation? Do you have glycotoxicity? Do you have insulin resistance? Do you have enough trophic and hormonal and nutritional support? Do you have vascular risk factors? All of these are contributors to suboptimal cognition. And so again, we encourage everyone to get evaluated, get on early prevention, optimize your brain function. Your brain will thank you. You will feel better and perform better. So absolutely, there are tests to do that, and we typically do it through the pre-code or recode program. And we recommend, you can start simply with a CQ test to see where you stand.
So Dale, I mean, I'll wait if there's any more questions, but I'm a bit baffled in the sense that how come it's becoming now this thing, that the elephant, I would say, is about 10 years, right? I don't think the elephant was there. It was cancer. It was other things. So what happened in our behavior? Is it the life expectancy change? But it didn't, right? In the 10 years, it hasn't gone from 50 to 87 or whatever the number is, 84. So what's going on? Are we drastically changing our lifestyle? Is it we're recognizing it and labeling it? Like, it's what happened?
This is, this is such a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. When I was training in neurology, and this was back in the 1980s, we never saw people who had Alzheimer's who were in their 50s. We saw it late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Okay. Now, one of the most common things we see is people in their 50s, even late 40s, who have Alzheimer's disease. Wow. So a small amount of this is, yes, we recognize it better than we did back then. However, there were recent epidemiological studies showing that, no question, early Alzheimer's is absolutely on the rise. In fact, it's been the two big jumps in neurodegenerative disease are Parkinson's and early onset Alzheimer's, typically in the 50s, and as I said, even in the late 40s. Wow. What is going on here? You're absolutely right to ask that. We don't have the full answer, but what it looks like is happening is a combination. Number one, we're exposed to a more toxic environment than we ever have been before. The toxins are everywhere. Here in California, of course, we've been through California fires. That increases our risk. The big concern now with everyone is that people who are post-COVID may in fact have, in the long run, many of people who've had COVID have brain fog, and the brain fog may last months. And so again, ongoing systemic inflammation, increased risk for decline. And then of course, the fact that we have poorer diets than we had before. We have fewer micronutrients. The soil is to some extent depleted in many situations. We have non-organic things that we're eating. It turns out organics, very, very helpful. And so a lot of us have a high carbohydrate diet. Now, here's another thing that changed really in the 70s. And unfortunately, in the 1970s, we are unfortunately reaping the negative rewards of this. People said, oh my gosh, we have to have lower fat diets. And so what do they replace the calories with? Carbohydrates. And so we ended up having a poorer good fats diet with more simple carbs. And Dr. Robert Lustig has written a beautiful book called Metabolical, showing how these changes occurred in our food supply. They have wrought havoc on our cardiovascular system, on our cancer likelihood and risk, and in fact, on our dementia risk. So some of this is related to the fact that most of us have poor metabolism. The insulin resistance, as I said, incredibly common. Metabolic syndrome, which includes insulin resistance along with hypertension, often with some degree of obesity, high cholesterol, often with some prediabetes. That combination, called metabolic syndrome, is a high risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So it looks like the combination of toxins and poor nutrition has really contributed to this problem, unfortunately.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. If you were to give each one of us, right, as a general, I mean, I don't want to generalize it, but 3 to 5 things that we should consider to rethink or relook at, what would those be? Just, or you can do more also, like, maybe 7, whatever the number is, but just the real, I know you've said it, maybe we need to hear it the 3rd or 4th time because we've repeated it a few times. But I think, because we need to choose differently in certain areas. Like when you talk about molds, the 5 molds you spoke to, I'm getting the homes tested because molds are an issue in Hong Kong, Absolutely. But none of those 5s are on that report. So now I'm going to have to find a company that considers those 5 because it's not there. Now, maybe in another country, mold is not such a big issue. I don't know. Right. Yeah. So what would be?
By the way, the number 1 country in the world in terms of amount of Alzheimer's per capita is Finland. And one of the issues it has is molds and mycotoxicity. So yeah, so the things to consider, first and foremost, you have to change the thinking. Everyone's been told there's nothing we can do about this. You might get it someday. Don't worry about it because there's nothing you can do anyway. That's got to change completely. There's absolutely a lot that can be done about it. Everybody should be preventing it. And if you do have symptoms, please don't wait. That's the number 1 thing, to remember that, yes, there is something we can do about this. Number 2, get evaluated. If you have no symptoms, get a pre-code evaluation, look at some basics, and then you can then get yourself on an optimal protocol, which we recommend we have pre-code reports for people. If you already have symptoms, please don't wait. Again, the doctors will tell you, you might as well wait because there's nothing we can do about it anyway. We have published, and please take a look at the report we published that shows, in fact, that we had 84% of people actually improve their cognition. But as you might imagine, just as with so many other diseases, the longer you wait, the harder it is and the less complete the reversal. The earlier, the easier it is and the more complete the reversal. People will say, wow, actually my cognition's better than it's ever been. So that's the next piece. And then, as you said, there are the big 7 things that we can all think about. And those are diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detoxification, and some targeted supplements. So those are good. But again, knowing what's actually causing the decline is what will give you the best outcomes. And we've trained now over 2,000 physicians in 10 different countries and all over the United States. So and anyone can look these up and get evaluated and get an optimal protocol.
Yeah, so if it's okay with you, Dale, we'll share in the email for the recordings and on the link the study you've done so that people can have some substance behind this conversation, because there's some people who obviously want to see, you know, what happened and how you did it, right? So again, Dale, thank you very much. Yeah, and the name and the details of the book with the link, so that way we can share it with everyone. So you summarized it. Any last thoughts? Anything you want to kind of shake us up with or wake us up with? I mean, you just did the summary, but
yeah, I think we should finish where we started. Alzheimer's is now optional. So I know that's a lot to wrap your head around, but please, everyone, remember that. Get on an optimal prevention or early treatment. Get the right tests done and make sure that you don't have problems because there's so much we can all do for this. And let's all work together. We can reduce the global burden of dementia.
No, it's beautiful. I mean, all the families we care for are slowly choosing to do the pre-code and the recode depending on what stage they're in. You know, and so we're really blessed to have you with us, Dale, not only today, but as part of the ecosystem. And, you know, I've done the cognoscopy and I added the 2 supplements, right? The MitoQ and the NeuroQ. And, you know, I'm very particular what I add to the system. So thank you again, Dale. Thank you everyone for being here. Dale, good night to you. It's very late. So thank you for staying up. We'll share all the resources with everyone. And really, it's been a beautiful conversation, a real eye-opener, a real expansion of how we can prevent and understand what happened, right? Because it's just, you know, and like I said, that it's really an elephant in the room. And, you know, many of, you know, the people we care for in their 40s and 50s are fitter than ever, but they're still concerned about dementia, right? So even though they are, you know, feeling stronger and all, they're still concerned, and that's not comforting. But now, after hearing this and looking at it, I think, you know, hopefully you've brought a little bit of ease to many people's concerns of, like you said, it's optional. So let us choose differently, as you said, Dale.
We feel very positive because there's a tremendous amount that can be done now, and we really can make this the rare disease that it should be. So thanks very much, Feisal. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week. We're going to have a trio to talk about the circular economy and the families and how they can contribute. And that will be next week at 7 p.m. Hong Kong time. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
And see you next
again.
week. Bye-bye.